Hello everyone, tonight we're stepping straight into the cobblestone streets of revolutionary Paris. It's 1793, and if you close your eyes, you can almost feel the damp autumn wind brushing against your cheek, carrying the scent of old bread, coal smoke, and something darker, a thick atmosphere of anger and fear. Just ahead, a creaking wooden cart rolls by, carrying the figure of a woman in a torn chemise. Her once powdered hair is now a tangled nest. That is Marie Antoinette, the queen who once danced through halls glittering with diamonds, now dragged through the jeers of thousands, headed straight for the guillotine. The scene is nightmarish, and honestly, you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in her thin silk shoes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're listening, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this. Marie Antoinette's final morning did not begin with triumphant trumpets or the soft voice of a servant waking her to be dressed. It began with the heavy scrape of an iron key turning in the lock of her cell. Dim light spilled through the narrow window bars, illuminating a pale face that had long lost its regal pride. Her hair, once the fashion icon of Europe, was now a tangled, sweat-drenched mess streaked with straw. The clothes she wore had nothing queenly about them. A white chemise, patched so many times it resembled a burial shroud. Footsteps of the guards echoed down the corridor. No one called her queen anymore. They called her the Widow Capet. A cold, deliberate name meant to strip away all trace of royalty. When the guards entered to deliver the news, she merely bowed her head and nodded. Not a single tear. Only her hands trembled as she fingered a tiny rosary, the last gift from a secret friend who had smuggled it into the cell. Can you picture it? A woman once praised as the embodiment of luxury, once seated on a throne with hundreds bowing before her, now reduced to a thin frame huddled against a cold stone wall, waiting for the hour of execution. Outside, the crowd had gathered since dawn, the crunch of boots on gravel, the cries of bread sellers, triumphant laughter, arguments in the streets, ordinary sounds of a Paris drunk on revolution. But to Marie, it must have felt like a cruel play in which she was forced to perform her final humiliation. Some say that as she stepped onto the cart that would carry her to the scaffold, her back remained straight, her chin slightly raised. She did not beg, did not weep, did not resist. Still, every step was marked with silent disgrace. Those nearest whispered that she had aged 20 years in a single autumn. As the cart began to roll through the streets, the mob screamed insults. "Time to pay," one man shouted. Another hurled a piece of hard bread at her, but she did not flinch. She didn't even blink. Perhaps in her mind, she had already left Paris long ago, drifting back to memories of youth in Vienna, the scent of orange blossoms, glittering candlelit balls, the soft strains of a harp. Think about it. When facing death, who wouldn't cling to a beautiful memory to hold off the fear? The journey lasted more than half an hour. Throughout, Marie sat motionless, fingers wrapped tightly around her worn rosary. Every turn of the cart's wheels scraped across cobblestones she may once have glided over in a gilded procession. That cruel contrast, thrown to scaffold, etched her story as one of the greatest tragedies of a fallen dynasty. When the cart reached the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine awaited, the noise swelled like thunder. People pushed to catch a glimpse of the enemy of the nation. She was helped down from the cart. Her breath shivered in the cold morning air. A guard stepped forward to cut her hair, all of it, to clear the way for the blade. Tufts of dull white fell like remnants of faded glory. There was a moment when she staggered, dizzy. Then she stood upright again, not a single cry. It said she whispered to the priest at her side, "Pray for me, Father." The steps to the scaffold were short, just a few, but for Marie Antoinette, they were likely the longest of her life. You're hearing this story in a quiet, darkened room, and perhaps your heart tightens a little as you imagine a woman who once held the power of millions in her hands, now left with nothing but a thread of fear, a final flicker of pride, and a weary, fading body. When she reached the final step, a small incident occurred. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. She looked up and gently said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." That was the final utterance of Marie Antoinette, a whisper of apology in a square roaring with fury. A short drum roll sounded. A second later, the blade fell, ending forever the story of a queen once hated, once worshipped, and ultimately turned into a symbol of a fallen era. Tonight, as you lie there and close your eyes, you might find yourself wondering, are power, beauty, and gold, all the things people kill each other for, truly worth it? Perhaps Marie Antoinette once asked herself the same question, but the answer vanished with her final breath, dissolved into the gray autumn sky of Paris that year. But to understand how a queen once seated atop Europe came to mount the scaffold, you need to go back a few more years. Imagine Paris not as a city steeped in fear, but as a capital of celebration where gilded carriages glided down boulevards shaded by elm trees. Marie Antoinette, then young and beautiful, was nicknamed Madame Deficit by the court for her bottomless spending on dresses, jewels, and extravagant soirees. It was said that a single one of her dinners could cost enough to feed an entire province for months. And still, while the people starved, Marie continued to spend, convinced that the throne would always protect her. But history has never been kind to the arrogant. Soon, vicious rumors spread through taverns and underground print shops. They said she was unfaithful, that she betrayed France's interests for Austria, her homeland. They spat her name as La Chrétienne, that Austrian woman. A slur laced with both rage and dread. As the monarchy faltered, hatred for the queen swelled by the day. Hungry mobs began smashing open granaries. Women of Paris marched to Versailles, shouting, "Bread, bread," a cry so desperate and hollow it chilled the blood. Marie Antoinette stood on a balcony, her white dress billowing in the wind. Some claimed that when told the people were starving, she coldly replied, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake." Though historians still debate whether she ever said it, the phrase became a symbol of the chasm between royalty and the people. That's when fate began to tighten its grip. When the revolution broke out, the Bourbon dynasty began to fracture. King Louis XVI was hesitant, indecisive, and Marie, raised in the politically ruthless Habsburg court, was even more stubborn, dismissive of the people's wrath. But the power of the mob outweighs any crown. Versailles was stormed. The royal family was dragged back to Paris like criminals. Imagine this. One night, the queen wakes in the Tuileries palace. No music, no balls. Only the flicker of oil lamps and the sound of guards pacing the courtyard. Everything she had believed to be eternal, power, status, worship, was now a fading memory. Still, Marie Antoinette refused to let go of the belief that she was chosen by God. She secretly sent letters begging European monarchs to send troops and rescue her. That was the final straw. When Prussian and Austrian armies approached the borders, the people of Paris panicked and turned furious. They saw her as a spy, a traitor, a threat that had to be eliminated. From that point on, the path to the guillotine had no turns. Imagine this. Before she became the widow Capet, before she climbed the scaffold, Marie Antoinette had lived through years where no one dared say no to her. At age 14, she was sent from Vienna to marry into France, cementing an alliance between two powerful dynasties. It is said that when her royal procession crossed into France, thousands gathered just to glimpse the Austrian princess. A girl with gray-blue eyes, golden hair, and a sweet smile that enchanted all. After days of lavish wedding ceremonies, Marie Antoinette was crowned Queen of France, the most powerful woman in Versailles. Her life from then on was drowned in unimaginable luxury. Picture it. Every morning, she awoke in a massive, gold-trimmed bed draped with silk. Gentle music played in the corner while ladies-in-waiting prepared the lever, the Queen's rising ceremony. 12 of the noblest women at court, the Dames du Palais, were tasked with dressing her, layer upon layer of petticoats, corsets, gowns, sashes, pearls, and finally, a dress embroidered with gold, weighing dozens of pounds. The cost of these daily rituals was staggering. One year, she ordered over 300 new dresses, so many that even the finance minister turned pale. They said her annual wardrobe budget alone could feed tens of thousands of the poor. And then, there was her dining. Marie's breakfast usually consisted of hot chocolate, white bread with butter, almond candies, and rare fruits imported from Italy. But it was dinner that truly showcased her opulence. At Versailles, the Queen's dining table stretched so long that multiple rows of chairs were needed for her guests. Over 100 dishes were served: foie gras, rabbit stewed in wine, fresh fish from the Loire River, and dessert plates piled high with strawberry tarts, almond cakes, and candied fruits. There were dozens of wines, champagne for the queen and Burgundy for the guests. On many nights, when Marie and her friends played cards until dawn, they emptied entire cellars, and she didn't limit her extravagance to the palace. Marie Antoinette even built a mock country village within the Versailles grounds, called the Hameau de la Reine. There, she wore simple cotton dresses, a straw hat, and pretended to be a peasant girl, milking cows in stalls that were scrubbed clean every day to look authentically tidy. It was said that while the people of Paris stood in long lines for bread, Marie Antoinette strolled happily among rose gardens, admiring sheep that were brushed each morning to stay free of mud. When in need of amusement, she invited opera singers, Italian actors, and violinists to perform in her private theater. Tickets were reserved for a select few. Every red velvet chair, every stage curtain embroidered in gold thread, was paid for by the national treasury. People said Marie was devoted to the card game baccarat. On some nights, she lost thousands of livres, a sum that could pay a craftsman's debts for an entire lifetime, but she didn't care. Each time she lost, she would simply laugh, dust off her hands, and signal the royal treasurer to settle the debt. To the French people, none of this was seen as harmless fun, but as proof of a blind, wasteful regime. Then came the discovery of a massive diamond necklace, Le Collier de la Reine, worth nearly 2 million livres, tied to her name in a scandalous fraud. Though Marie insisted she was innocent, the diamond necklace affair shattered the last fragile remnants of her credibility. From then on, every time Marie appeared on the palace balcony, the crowds would roar, "Cake, cake," a mocking cry that she had no concept of hunger or hardship. You see, when lavish feasts and heavy silk gowns become symbols of injustice, the end of the throne is never far away. To understand why everything collapsed so quickly, you must first know that France under Louis XVI was already a castle built on sand. Imagine this. Louis ascended the throne in 1774, at just 20 years old. From the very beginning, he was not a natural leader. He was quiet, gentle, more interested in tinkering with locks and hunting than reading state reports. France at the time was drowning in financial crisis. Prolonged wars, the 7 Years' War, followed by support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. The national coffers were empty, and the debts so massive that annual interest payments consumed over half the budget. Though Louis wasn't the reckless spender many claimed he was, he lacked the resolve to slash royal expenses. The Versailles court still held lavish balls, still spent fortunes on garments, rituals, and noble stipends. Meanwhile, ordinary life grew harsher by the day. Picture a Parisian baker in 1780. He rises before dawn, works 16-hour days, and still can't earn enough to afford a loaf of bread whose price climbs week by week. The economy was collapsing, society fracturing. But the political system was too archaic to mend. France still upheld the Ancien Regime, dividing people into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, holders of spiritual power and tax exemptions. The second estate, the nobility, owners of land, leaders of the army and administration. The third estate, everyone else, peasants, artisans, merchants, intellectuals. They were the vast majority, yet bore nearly all the taxes. As the treasury dwindled, Louis and his finance ministers repeatedly attempted to reform taxes, but every attempt to levy the nobility or church met fierce resistance. Louis convened the Assembly of Notables, a group of nobles and clergymen, to gain support. But they flatly rejected all reforms. Then, in 1789, he was forced to do something not done in 175 years: summon the Estates General. Initially, The king hoped the assembly would approve a financial solution. But the pent-up fury of the people transformed the meeting into the first act of revolution. The Third Estate delegates, representing most of France, declared themselves a national assembly, vowing to draft a new constitution. Imagine it, a king who believed in his divine right now, being challenged by hundreds within his own palace. Louis panicked. He tried ordering the assembly's dissolution, tried applying military pressure, then hesitated, backtracked, invited negotiation. That hesitation cost him the last of his authority. Meanwhile, Paris was boiling. Bread prices soared. Rumors of an army crackdown spread through the streets. On the 14th of July, 1789, the masses stormed the Bastille, the symbol of feudal power. Louis XVI didn't want war with his people, but he also couldn't bring himself to yield. His indecision turned a crisis into a revolution. Over the next 3 years, royal power was chipped away piece by piece. The National Assembly drafted a new constitution, stripping many of the monarchy's privileges. A free press emerged, skewering the queen and court. On one side stood Louis, still hoping to reconcile the old order with new demands. On the other, the people and their increasingly radical leaders. So what truly brought Louis XVI from throne to scaffold? Imagine throughout the summer of 1792, Paris simmered like a boiling cauldron. Alarming news of Prussian and Austrian troops nearing the border spread rapidly. It was believed Marie Antoinette had secretly pleaded for their aid to restore royal rule. Every newspaper, every pamphlet painted the queen as a danger within, a crowned spy. Amidst it all, on the 25th of July, the Brunswick Manifesto appeared, a declaration from General Brunswick threatening the people of Paris that if any harm befell the king and queen, the Allied armies would exact severe vengeance. So, it was the final straw. On the 10th of August, 1792, Paris simmered with heat, as if holding in the fury of tens of thousands. From early morning, crowds of workers, artisans, and units of the National Guard gathered at the Place du Carrousel, in front of the Tuileries Palace gates. Can you picture the scene? The ground trembling with boots, the drums pounding, the tricolor flag rippling in the air. Inside the Tuileries, Louis and his family tried to remain calm. The king wore his black velvet ceremonial attire. The queen sat silently with their 2 young children. But outside, the crowd was ready to storm. Around 8 a.m., cannons began firing at the palace gates. Black smoke billowed. Gunfire rang out across the square. The Tuileries Guard, mostly Swiss mercenaries loyal to the king, and tried to resist, but they were far outnumbered by the mob. Within a few hours, hundreds lay dead in a bloody clash. By midday, the surviving Swiss guards were forced to surrender. The crowd flooded into the Tuileries, looting and smashing every symbol of monarchy. Louis had no other choice. He and his family quietly left the palace, walking through gardens strewn with the bodies of fallen guards, heading toward the National Assembly to seek refuge. Imagine it, the King of France, holding his son's hand, blending into the crowd, stripped of all regal bearing. When he appeared, the assembly fell into stunned silence for a few seconds. Then they acted quickly, stripped him of royal authority, and placed the entire family under arrest in the Temple Tower. That day, the 10th of August, 1792, was the day the Bourbon monarchy fell. After that, events only grew more extreme. Purge after purge swept through Paris. Anyone suspected of royalist sympathies could be arrested or executed. Meanwhile, Louis was imprisoned in a cold, sealed room, with guards posted day and night. All communication with the outside world was monitored. A revolutionary tribunal was formed to try the king. The trial began in December 1792. In the courtroom, Louis XVI was no longer King of France, but citizen Louis Capet, charged with treason and conspiracy with foreign powers. He listened in silence as a long list of accusations was read: violating the Constitution, attempting to flee, colluding with foreign enemies. Imagine it, a man who once believed his power was divinely ordained, now standing quietly, unable to protest as each indictment was pronounced. Though a few delegates favored leniency, the atmosphere of hatred was overwhelming. The final vote sealed his fate: death. On the 21st of January, 1793, the sky over Paris was gray. At the Place de la Revolution, the guillotine stood ready. Louis mounted the scaffold in silence, asking only to speak a few final words to the people. He raised his head, his voice calm. "I die innocent. I hope that my blood may never fall upon the head of France." The drums drowned out the rest. A second later, the blade fell. And so the man who once wore the most radiant crown in Europe died like a criminal. Somewhere, in her prison cell, Marie Antoinette heard the news that her husband had been executed. Imagine that moment. Everything she once believed to be unshakable, love, power, lineage, turned to ash. That was the beginning of her final tragedy. After Louis was guillotined, Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen, no longer Madame de Fisset, no longer even a political pawn. She was just a widow, despised and feared, locked away in the damp confines of the conciergerie, what people called the antechamber to death. Imagine that cell with its freezing stone walls, a window no more than a slit, letting in a faint yellow light. Each night, she lay on a hard wooden bed, the blanket so thin the wind pierced through it to the bone. On the 14th of October, 1793, Paris was drizzled with rain. Marie Antoinette was ordered to stand trial. They say that morning, she wore a tattered old chemise, her white hair visible under a thin shawl. When the guards opened the door, she rose slowly, so emaciated she looked like a ghost. Crowds packed the streets as she was led to court. Many whistled, cursed, threw mud, but Marie did not bow her head. She did not cry. The Revolutionary Tribunal convened in a large chamber, tricolor flags hanging on the walls. At the center sat the council president, surrounded by jurors and the infamous prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville. Picture the scene: a gaunt woman in rags, standing alone in a vast room, surrounded by eyes filled with suspicion, hatred, and bloodlust. The charges were read aloud, stretching for dozens of pages. Marie Antoinette was accused of conspiring to undermine the Republic, colluding with foreign powers, squandering the national treasury, harming the people, and the most loathsome charge of all, corrupting public morality. Even baseless rumors were used against her. The prosecutor shouted, voice sharp as steel, "You are a wolf in sheep's clothing, a depraved woman who has brought misery upon this nation." At one point, he even went so far as to accuse her of incest with her own son, an attempt to destroy her utterly. Imagine that moment. In the cold courtroom, Marie Antoinette went pale, placing a hand on her chest as her breath faltered. But then she raised her head, her voice trembling yet firm. "I do not respond to this charge. I appeal to every mother here to bear witness to my heart." They say even the women in the gallery fell silent, that some lowered their eyes in shame. The trial dragged on for nearly 2 days. Every defense was futile. The outcome had been decided long before. When the council president pronounced the sentence, his voice was dry and flat. "Citizen Marie Antoinette, the People's Council finds you guilty of treason. The sentence, death." She did not cry. She merely swayed, as if about to fall. Then, she gripped the small rosary hidden in her sleeve and took a deep breath. Imagine that moment. After all the years spent among silk and music and power, Marie Antoinette stood alone, hearing her fate sealed. The next day, Paris was cloaked in gloom. A wooden cart arrived at the gates of the conciergerie to take her to the scaffold, and thus ended the life of France's most infamous queen. On the morning of the 16th of October, 1793, Paris lay under a blanket of cold mist. The sound of church bells drifted lazily over damp rooftops. In the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette had not slept. She had no more tears. Her body was drained. Her silver hair hung in wiry strands around a hollow face. Imagine the prison door creaked open softly. A guard stepped in, his voice flat. "It is time." She rose slowly, fingers clutching the small rosary. The priest accompanying her bowed his head, placing a hand on her shoulder as a final gesture of comfort. The cart for the condemned waited outside the prison gate. Not the enclosed carriage of kings, but a crude wooden cart, open to the crowd for all to see. It said Marie had to climb aboard using a narrow step. With each step, her white chemise brushed against planks muddied with dirt and horse dung. When she sat down, a guard bound her hands behind her back. She didn't resist, only took a deep breath and looked straight ahead. The cart began its slow roll through the narrow streets toward the Place de la Revolution. Along the way, the crowd pressed in, jostling for a glimpse. Some whistled, others threw trash, some screamed, "Witch! Murderer!" But she gave no reply. Imagine it a woman who once wore a dazzling crown, now seated alone in a wooden cart, hollow eyes sunken, hands bound, silver hair hanging limp around her shoulders. One witness claimed that throughout the hour-long ride, Marie never bowed her head, never cried. She stared straight ahead, as if gazing past the mob, past the insults, toward somewhere far away where no one could reach her. When the cart arrived, the guillotine loomed under a gray sky. The steel blade gleamed faintly. 2 guards helped her down. Her long hair covered her shoulders. One executioner stepped forward, grabbed a handful of hair, and yanked it back to prepare her neck for the fall. Imagine that moment, her hair falling in clumps onto the damp wooden platform, cold air sliced across her bare neck like a sting. Marie Antoinette staggered slightly, then stood upright again. She didn't beg, she didn't scream. The steps to the scaffold were only a dozen, but for her, they were the longest of her life. With each step, her white chemise fluttered. It said that as she reached the final one, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. She looked up and said, her voice small and hoarse, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Her final words, a whisper of apology, still lingered in the air as she stepped into the wooden frame. The executioner tied her hands behind her back, bound her ankles to prevent resistance. Close your eyes and imagine. The drum began to beat, each thud drowning out the crowd. Marie knelt on the board. The wooden collar closed around her neck. No one heard her say another word. Then, in a moment of stillness, the steel blade hissed through the air. A dry, sharp thud echoed. The drums fell silent. An executioner lifted her silver hair and severed head, turning to show it to the crowd on all sides. Thousands stood quiet for a heartbeat, then erupted in cheers, whistles, and applause. Think of it, the death of a queen once worshipped like a goddess of luxury. All that remained was a frail body and white hair. The only thing they could not take from her. That day, the Bourbon monarchy ended for good, and Marie Antoinette became a ghost in France's memory, cursed, pitied, haunting. You might wonder, after Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were guillotined, what happened to France? Did the storms suddenly calm? The people find peace? The country enter an age of happiness? Number. On the contrary, their deaths were like throwing oil onto a fire that had smoldered for years. Immediately after the king's execution, the convention declared the birth of the French Republic. No more throne, no more tax-exempt nobility, no more church as the unshakable pillar of faith. Imagine a country that had lived under feudal rule for centuries, suddenly stripped of all its familiar foundations. The old order was gone, but a new one had yet to fully form. In Paris, revolutionary factions began vying for power. The Girondins advocated moderate reform, hoping to avoid meaningless violence. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, believed that only terror could save the Republic. Fear quickly turned into fanaticism. Imagine prisoner carts rolling in endless procession through the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine worked almost without pause. Each morning, the names of dozens were read aloud. Nobles, priests, peasants, merchants. Anyone suspected of being counter-revolutionary. The reign of terror began. From September 1793 to the summer of 1794, over 16,000 people were officially executed. Tens of thousands more died in prison or were killed without trial. Picture Paris at that time. Streets filled with posters urging citizens to denounce traitors, revolutionary guards searching every home, bakery, and forge. The air was so thick with fear that brothers betrayed brothers, friends turned away, fathers distanced themselves from sons. Everything once deemed noble was shattered. Churches were turned into temples of reason, saint statues pulled down and smashed. Catholic rites were banned, priests arrested or exiled. A new calendar was invented, called the Revolutionary Calendar, dividing the year into 12 months, with names like Brumaire and Thermidor. Meanwhile, France was also under siege from without. Monarchies across Europe, terrified of the Republic, formed a coalition to encircle it. Hundreds of thousands of young men were conscripted, clad in blue-gray uniforms, singing La Marseillaise on their way to war. Imagine a country that had just executed its king, now fighting to preserve its own existence. And yet, paradoxically, in that chaos and terror, France generated an enormous surge of energy. The Republican army pushed back the Austro-Prussian coalition at the borders. New young generals emerged, among them, an obscure Corsican named Napoleon Bonaparte. Back in Paris, the machinery of terror kept grinding human lives. By the summer of 1794, Robespierre's brutality had horrified even the convention. On the 27th of July of that year, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre was overthrown and executed on the very guillotine he had used to execute thousands. The terror ended. France entered another chaotic phase, the Directory period, where politics became a never-ending power game. Factions overthrew one another rapidly, the currency collapsed, and the people grew exhausted. But from those ashes, a figure would rise who would change all of Europe. His name was Napoleon. Imagine, in 1793, the city of Toulon rose up against the Republic, inviting British forces in. Among the many officers jockeying for influence, Napoleon volunteered to take charge of the artillery. Within weeks, he organized fortifications, positioned the batteries, and crushed the rebellion. The city fell. That victory earned him a promotion to general before the age of 25. From there, the path opened like a gale. In the years that followed, France remained at war with nearly all of Europe: Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain. In Paris, the Directory held power, but it was merely a corrupt oligarchy, consumed by endless infighting. The people were weary. Many began longing for a strong hand to restore order and glory. Napoleon understood that. Close your eyes and imagine. November 1799, the skies over Paris are cold and gray. In a single morning, Napoleon, backed by military prestige and a few key allies within the government, dissolves the National Assembly and declares the formation of the consulate. Within hours, the chaotic republic is overturned, replaced by a new regime. Napoleon proclaims himself first consul, then, just a few years later, crowns himself emperor in a ceremony that, had Marie Antoinette still been alive, she might never have believed could happen so swiftly. Picture the scene on the 2nd of December, 1804, inside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Napoleon, dressed in deep red ceremonial robes, holding a diamond-studded crown, walks past rows of bowed clergy, generals, and former nobles. He does not allow the Pope to place the crown on his head. Instead, he raises it himself, slowly setting it upon his hair, as if to declare, "This power I take for myself." From an obscure artillery officer, Napoleon had become Emperor of the French, conqueror of nearly all Europe. But if you look back, you'll see. It all began on a summer night in 1789, when the crowd stormed the Bastille. From those hungry autumn days when Parisians cried out for bread. From the life of luxury turned hated in Marie Antoinette. From the indecisive weakness of Louis XVI. And from the fall of the guillotine that ended one dynasty, only to usher in an even more ambitious and ruthless era. Now, you lie in a quiet room, listening to a story from over 200 years ago. A tale of power, fear, and the eternal human dream to rise above all others. Perhaps, when you wake tomorrow, Paris will still be the city of lights and pastries, but tonight, it is only the stage of ghosts, a silver-haired queen, a silent king, and a young officer climbing toward the summit. And indeed, even as first consul, and later as emperor, Napoleon launched sweeping reforms that transformed France into a stronger, more centralized machine than ever before. First, he overhauled the administrative system. Imagine a France divided into hundreds of regions, each with its own laws, taxes, and court systems. Napoleon despised such disorder. He reorganized the country into 83 administrative departments, each governed by a prefect appointed by the central government. These prefects were not old nobles, but civil servants chosen for their merit. Their duties: collect taxes, maintain order, enforce laws. For the first time in centuries, France had a unified administrative structure, from Paris to the smallest village. Napoleon also focused heavily on restoring financial order. Under the Revolution, paper money had collapsed in value. Gold and silver had nearly disappeared from circulation. To fix this, Napoleon founded the Bank of France in 1800, granting it authority over money issuance. He implemented a more scientific taxation system, abolished tax exemptions for the nobility and clergy, and established a stable revenue stream for the state. But his most famous and enduring reform was the Napoleonic Code. Imagine, before that, every region had its own laws. The North clung to medieval customs, the South to Roman influence. Napoleon resolved to create a single civil code for the entire country. In 1804, the Civil Code was enacted, laying out foundational principles. All citizens are equal before the law. Property rights are sacred. The father is the head of the family, with broad authority over wife and children. Though conservative, especially in its treatment of women. The Napoleonic Code became the legal foundation not just for France, but for much of Europe. To this day, many of its principles remain in the legal systems of France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. Napoleon also deeply understood the power of education. He established the lycée system, state-run secondary schools designed to train a new class of civil servants. He believed that to sustain the empire, a disciplined generation, educated in science, military affairs, and administration, was essential. It was also under his leadership that the foundation was laid for a merit-based civil service system, where individuals rose not by birthright, but by talent. Imagine that. From a society where nobles were entitled to rule, France transformed into one where anyone, no matter how poor, could advance if they were capable. Beyond domestic reforms, Napoleon also reshaped relations with the Catholic Church. During the Revolution, the Church had been persecuted, its property seized, priests killed or exiled. Napoleon understood that without reconciliation, French society would remain unstable. In 1801, he signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the majority, while allowing the Church to operate again under state oversight. This treaty eased much of the public's resentment and further solidified Napoleon's position. Alongside governance, Napoleon built a masterful propaganda machine. Imagine all across France, paintings, statues, medals mass-produced bearing his image as a savior. The press was tightly controlled. Theaters were permitted only to perform plays that praised the Republic or the Emperor. He even issued exaggerated bulletins of victory, regardless of the actual outcome on the battlefield. All to construct one image. Napoleon was not merely a ruler, but the embodiment of national glory. Alongside these reforms, Napoleon remained a tireless commander. From 1804 to 1812, he repeatedly defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia, asserting near-total dominance over Europe. Each victory brought the Napoleonic Code to conquered lands, transforming laws and administrative systems. Imagine it, reforms born in revolutionary France, carried by Napoleon's sword, spreading to hundreds of millions across the Elbe River to the Italian peninsula, from Spain to Poland. Though he was later overthrown and died in exile on a remote island, many of his legacies endured. The Napoleonic Code, the lycées, the Bank of France, the departmental system, all survived, adapted, and continued by generations to come. And perhaps that was what Napoleon desired most. Not just to be a warrior, but the architect of a new modern society. But history never allows any empire to last forever, and the cracks of overreaching ambition had already begun to spread, even as he believed himself invincible. After the glorious victory at Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon grew increasingly convinced that his will was natural law. Each year, he dragged armies into wars. Austria, Prussia, Spain, Russia, campaigns that devoured hundreds of thousands of lives. Picture it, Paris glowing with the lights of victory celebrations, while in the countryside, families mourned sons who never returned. In 1808, Napoleon intervened in the Iberian Peninsula, deposing the King of Spain and placing his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. But the Spanish people did not yield. A brutal guerrilla war ignited. Every road, every village, hid snipers waiting for French troops. This mighty empire began to bleed from thousands of small wounds, losing dozens, even hundreds of soldiers each day to ambushes, disease, and an invisible, implacable hatred. Meanwhile, Napoleon imposed the continental system, banning all trade with Britain in hopes of strangling its economy. But the blockade backfired on France. Commerce plummeted, prices soared, and the people, exhausted by war and taxes, began to murmur. Imagine it. Those who once hailed him as a savior now whispered, "When will peace finally return?" In 1812, Napoleon made his greatest mistake, launching a massive invasion of Russia. He believed that one decisive victory would force Tsar Alexander I to submit. In June of that year, over 600,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen, crossed the Niemen River and entered Russian territory. At first, there was no major battle. The Russians retreated, burning their supplies and villages as they went, leaving behind a frozen, bloodthirsty wasteland. By September, Napoleon reached Moscow, but the city was no prize. Moscow had been nearly completely burned. There were no provisions, no warehouses, no shelter. Amid the brutal Russian winter, the Grand Army began to collapse. Close your eyes and imagine starving soldiers, their coats torn, boots worn down, trudging through endless fields of white snow. Temperatures fell to -30°C. Horses died. Men froze. Artillery was abandoned. Night after night, thousands perished in the cold, their bodies left unburied. By the time they retreated to Poland, fewer than 100,000 remained. The Russian disaster was a fatal blow to Napoleon's prestige. From across Europe, old enemies rose again. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Russia formed a new coalition. In 1813, he tried to rally his forces at the Battle of Leipzig, the largest battle in European history at that time. But the empire was exhausted. Over 500,000 coalition troops encircled the French army. After 3 days of brutal fighting, Napoleon was defeated and forced to retreat across the Rhine. Imagine Paris then. The people were weary of endless war. Secret pamphlets circulated, claiming the emperor brought only death. Even once loyal generals began to waver. In 1814, coalition forces reached the gates of Paris. On the 31st of March, Tsar Alexander and the King of Prussia entered the French capital amid a silent crowd. Napoleon knew it was over. On the 6th of April, he signed the act of abdication, renouncing the throne in favor of his son. The empire fell. Napoleon was allowed to keep the honorary title of emperor and was exiled to the tiny island of Elba off the Italian coast. Imagine a man who once ruled millions, now reduced to a handful of attendants, a barren island, and endless memories of lost glory. But the story wasn't over. Just 1 year later, Napoleon took one final gamble. In March 1815, he crossed the sea back to France with 1,000 loyal soldiers. As he marched toward Paris, the troops sent to arrest him turned their guns around and joined him. The people cheered. King Louis XVIII fled. Napoleon returned to the throne for a brief period known as the 100 Days. But Europe would not allow his return. In June 1815, on a small field in Belgium, British and Prussian forces confronted him. The final battle, Waterloo, was fought in mud and pouring rain. Napoleon was defeated. This time, there was no coming back. He was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. Meanwhile, the monarchs of Europe marched into Paris. On the 7th of July, 1815, British, Prussian, Austrian, and Russian troops filed through the Arc de Triomphe, the very monument Napoleon had built to celebrate his victories. It was a cruel irony. The very path he once paraded down in triumph had become the road for his conquerors. France was under occupation. The great powers gathered in Vienna to determine the fate of Europe. The Congress of Vienna, lasting from 1814 to 1815, aimed to restore the old order, eradicate the seeds of revolution, and crush France's imperial ambitions once and for all. The French throne was handed to Louis XVIII, younger brother of Louis XVI, who had spent nearly 20 years in exile. Like a closed circle, the Bourbon dynasty returned to Paris, while hundreds of thousands who had once served Napoleon hid their medals and silenced their old loyalties. Imagine, after the stormy years of revolution and empire, the French people suddenly found themselves back under monarchy. Emigrant nobles returned to reclaim their castles and lands. The tricolor flag of the Republic was lowered, replaced by the white banner of the Bourbons. Many of Napoleon's generals and officials were dismissed, forced into quiet retirement or exile in Belgium or Switzerland. But not everything returned to how it had been. For even as Louis XVIII wore the crown, France had changed profoundly. The ideas of liberty, equality, and secularism sown by the revolution could not be erased by a royal decree. The Napoleonic Code remained. The administrative, educational, and judicial systems he built endured because they were simply more effective than the old feudal ways. The Bourbons were compelled to issue the Charter of 1814, recognizing basic civil rights, property ownership, limited freedom of the press, and a bicameral parliament. It was a compromise. The monarchy restored, but not absolute. In the hearts of the people, the memory of Napoleon did not fade. In rural villages, veterans quietly passed around portraits of him. Children still sang songs celebrating the emperor. Someone once said a famous line, "When the Bourbons returned, they thought they could erase 15 years as one wipes chalk from a slate, but they forgot that Napoleon had written on the heart of all France." Economic recovery in the early years was slow. Decades of war had emptied the treasury, devastated farmland, and crippled trade. Many families had lost fathers, sons, too many to start again easily after 20 years of conflict. Allied troops remained in France until 1818, before finally withdrawing. National pride had suffered deeply. The French, once proud to be the teachers of Europe, were now forced to bow their heads as the victors marched through their capital. And yet, during that same period, a new middle class began to emerge. They were merchants, lawyers, civil servants, people raised under the Revolution and the Empire, who believed that one day, France would rise stronger, and they were not wrong. In the 3 decades that followed, France would undergo 2 more revolutions, one that toppled the Bourbons again, and another that gave rise to the Second Empire under Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III. You see, the story of France after Napoleon was not a conclusion. It was the prologue to new upheavals.